Hey there, friends. I hope that you enjoy this episode of the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I want to take a moment here at the beginning to extend a special offer, an invitation to you, our dear listeners, to join the Remembering course. Our next start date is going to be in middle of March. This is a powerful, deeply moving, and for many people, transformational experience into the heart of colonization, climate change, family histories, ancestors, and so many other critical intersecting pieces. Just visit our website, Sequoia Samanvaya. All the information is in the link below.
Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and reenchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and reenchanting.
Hello, my name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and you are listening to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. I am particularly delighted to have with me today Victoria Loorz. Victoria Loorz has been a pastor for quite some time. She has served in many roles and in many types of ways of pastoring. And she's worked in the corporate world with religious congregations and organizations as a mother, and currently as a traveling minister for the Church of the Wild. She wrote this beautiful book, which I've actually, to be totally transparent, have been recommending.
Thank you.
I've been recommending this book, Church of the Wild, How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred, particularly to two different folk, 2 different types of people, some of whom are actively asking these questions about how do we create spiritual communities with a really deep ecological, embedded in the wild, embedded in our ecologies, embedded into our relationship with nature. And also to those who are teaching on eco-theology or who are trying to bring eco-theology into either classrooms or seminaries and church communities. This is a really great book because it is both very theological and foundationally a spiritual, one person, in this case, your spiritual journey. And it's a really beautiful rendition of a spiritual journey that I think will resonate with many of our listeners. So, thank you for joining us to talk about it.
Thank you so much. I'm excited. We've felt some resonance since we met, and I'm excited to have this time with you. Thank you.
Yes, to the many resonances. I thought we could start off with just actually having you read the prologue, which is so beautifully written.
Happy to do that. The prologue to Church of the Wild. This is a story about a land where the trees talk and the waters croon and the people fall in love with birds who love them back. This is a story about an enchanted forest hiding in plain sight, invisible, until somehow the veil drops and what was unseen can suddenly be seen. You may catch a glimpse when you cross the threshold on the far edge of the abandoned field, or when just for a blinking instant you notice how the brambles of the blackberry bush connect you to everything. The ancestors knew this and reminded one another around their fires that they belonged to a great web of life. They were called into wilderness by a voice that spoke in words planted silently in their hearts, by the voices of the cedar trees, the lilies, the desert sands, sacred voices tucked into pockets of the wind. Some of these ancestors were called out of Egypt, out of oppressive systems that didn't acknowledge their lives as valuable, called into the wilderness to listen, to prepare, to be tested and encouraged and strengthened. There, the wild creatures of the night, the fiery bushes and cool streams, and the manna that fell from the sky reminded the people of their true identity. Once upon a time, all humans knew their lives, their food, their survival, their sense of meaning and kinship with God or the gods was connected with all their relations, the hawks and soil and ferns and mosquitoes. Like all the other wild creatures, they belonged to the land and they knew it. They were part of a grand conversation, a relationship of reciprocity and respect, connecting them with all the other beings and elements of life. But there came a time when some of the people could no longer hear the conversation. An elixir fell over the poppy fields like Dorothy entering Oz, causing them to fall asleep. The wax in their ears became hardened, and their hearts pretended that they were happier controlling the world than loving it. They rushed right past the burning bushes on the way to capital I importance, missing the message of the doe hiding in plain sight with her newborn fawn. They packed the bodies of sacred forest cathedrals onto trucks and shipped them to mills. They forgot that the thrush song spelled out warnings and wisdom in octaves. Disconnected little by little, their voices went missing in the symphony of aliveness. The songs of the wild god cascading through the trees no longer guided their lives, and a deep loneliness sunk down upon the people like a heavy fog nobody could see. Well, the time has come to lift that veil of fog and return to intimate relationship with the living world. More and more of us are taking our place once again as full participants in the web of life, which we remember is held together by love. There are no magic words to incant, no spiritual laws to memorize, no ruby slippered heels to click 3 times. You don't need to read 100 new eco-theology books or leave the church or become an animist or a pantheist, but you can if you want to. You simply need to learn how to listen and allow your heart to be broken, just like you do every time you fall in love, because the holy is in your place too. You open the gates into this enchanted land, your home, with hands muddied from the soil outside your house and a raw, scabby, and unprotected heart. You enter naked and brave.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. I'm wondering, how is it for you now to read it?
It's one of those little stories that came at 3 a.m. And I turned on the light and wrote it down and went back to sleep. And so it feels, it's sort of a poem. And so it feels like I don't remember writing it.
It came to you.
And it still feels, it feels like it captures the book in a way that doesn't explain it, but you can feel it.
Absolutely. I feel that when I listen to you read it, I hear the book in it. And, because so many of the people who I've engaged with and probably who listen to this podcast are themselves storytellers of various types and are thinking about questions of how do we tell stories differently, I kind of wanted to pull out a couple things in this that I thought were really kind of cool, not to emulate, but to highlight and to kind of name. One is like there's a way here in which you're playing with and expanding your own tradition. The enchanted forest is here. It's almost like I was actually evoked and kind of taken into when I first read it. C.S. Lewis's Narnia. You're kind of playing with that kind of childness and the adultness and asking this question in it that I think is so important, which is how does it mean to be a grown up who goes to the mountain of the enchantment of our childhood and who dares to bring the enchanted imagination of our childhood into and part of and live in that as an adult, not as something regulated into the life of children, but as something of substance into our adult life. You have a theology of an immanent deity who is very much alive in the wild, in the forest herself, and yet who is not limited either to immanence, which is like a nice balance, right? You're kind of balancing a transcendence and an immanence in it. And there's a way in which you're bridging between the ancestors of the past and of both Christian and animate and indigenous traditions. You're echoing to the Hebrew ancestors and what does it mean to come out of slavery. And at the same time, you're echoing to those, you're speaking to those ancestors who sit around fires. And of course, those two have strong overlaps. And to the ways in which different types of traditions can come together and different ancestors and different types of ancestors can come together in our lives. And there's, I think of this, I often think of this as like the extent to which we are able to resituate that ancient religious question, what does it mean to hear, to experience a call? How are these times and places and the movement of the spirit herself or himself in your life changing? Both a warning and a promise, a prophetic summoning of days to come.
Thank you for pulling that out. There's something that and that was intentional, the ancestors, and sort of this sense of not, when I say our ancestors, it can be exclusive. It's the ancestors, and the Hebrews are not my family ancestors. They're my, perhaps could be called spiritual ancestors. But we all, many of us, most of us, maybe all of us, have ancestors who have been oppressed and enslaved, and their freedom comes through the wilderness in the same way that this archetypal story of the Hebrews coming out of 400 years of enslavement. It takes at least 40 years to remember who they are after being treated so cruelly. And there's a just along that line too, there's a book that I love by Four Arrows, named Don Jacobs. He's an indigenous man who wrote a book called, many books, but one of them is called Restoring a Kinship Worldview. And he goes through about the tenets of an indigenous worldview and then a Western worldview. And it's a fantastic book. And one of the things he says in the very beginning is that we are all indigenous to this earth. We can kind of get caught up in white guilt and sort of a purity thing of where are we indigenous, and especially those of us whose ancestors have emigrated so long ago, what does that even mean? And Robin Wall Kimmerer says, we really can't be indigenous, but we can choose to belong. And I think that's the same thing. Like, we all actually do belong on this planet. We're here. And how do we find a way to acknowledge those who have been mistreated and diminished and devalued, to restore that dignity, both human and more than human, and at the same time recognize that we are part of that story. that we belong here, and our work to do any of the work that we're called to, whether it's restoring a little prairie, um, using products that are not harmful to the earth if you're a hairdresser, or if you are doing deep anti-racism work in the inner city. I mean, all of those are deeply interconnected, both the worldview that enslaves and has hierarchies, as well as the kinship worldview of restoration and wholeness that's possible, that we're all part of that evolving story of aliveness.
And that there is a belonging that can be shaped and experienced in love.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about, and it often feels like it's on the threshold. I was really struck by a passage you had later on, just a little bit later on in the book, where you were talking about, you're kind of describing yourself as an edge walker, and you talk about that kind of moment in that first prelude of the edge of the forest, where things seem to shimmer and a thin space might emerge. And you, on page 15, I'll read this section. Perhaps you are an edge walker too. Edge walkers occupy a thin space and are by definition a bit lonely. Most people inhabit the vast spaces on both sides of edges. But those of us called to the thresholds, the edges between, live in this thin space and recognize one another when we meet. The edges between biosystems are called ecotones. These thresholds usually contain the most biodiversity and therefore are the most resilient. A shoreline, for example, is the ecotone between the water and the land. Matter from the sea and the terrestrial shore is exchanged in these little intertidal zones, inviting more life forms to flourish. Those of us called to the ecotoned edges need one another. Kurt Vonnegut calls this kind of connection a karas, a word he made up that means a network or group of people who are somehow affiliated or linked spiritually. The time is coming soon when the edges we inhabit will start to redefine the center, and we will need to lean and learn from one another as we together engage in the work of that redefining. Each of us is characterized by our own unique gifts, communities of influence in a particular bioregion, but we cannot have silos. The more diverse our relationships are, the more resiliency we can hold on our individual edges. Every religion has an edge where the mystics live.
Thank you for reading that. Nice to listen to
it. And I was thinking, like, as I was seeing, there's just so many edges. There's so many that the image of the center and the edge is almost unhelpful sometimes, because it almost takes away how many edges there are. I mean, just in my street, there's the edge between like the creek and like where the creek kind of becomes a different creek.
Yeah.
And like where the creek meets becomes the forest, and where the forest becomes a road, and where the road, forest
Right.
becomes a little valley.
Edges are everywhere.
Edges are everywhere.
And nowhere. And there really aren't edges, like I have most of the people I work with, I sort of define by this pretend paradigm that if Christianity had edges, which of course it pretends it does, that the people that I work with are either on the inside edge, sort of pressed up against the edge, no longer willing to or able to connect with much of the traditional church, and certainly not her history. It was so violent. Or people who have, but they don't feel they're ready to leave. They don't feel like they need to completely disassociate from the Christ tradition. Or there's people who have left a long time ago or have never been in it, but feeling drawn back to the outside edge, where the mystics live and where there is a grounding and a tradition and a history. And so it's on those edges. And I used to picture that edge as like something, like if you're walking along the edge of a mountain where where it falls off on both sides. It's sort of a trepidation. But I don't see it like that. I see it much more of like much more organic and sort of membrane like. That the edges, those of us called to be on these edges, the more we expand to where we're called and to stepping into unknown territory, the more we're actually expanding the whole, because we're still connected. It's not a break. It feels like a break sometimes when we step over those those thresholds, when we step into an area that is not accepted by our community or our family or our own definition of who we are. But when we do that, when we step into that unknown and live with that within that unknown and allow that to shape us, we are actually in some way shaping the whole, expanding the whole, but by those edges expanding like a membrane.
Mm. Mm-hmm. And imagine those like kind of two sides of those membranes, like they are very close together and they communicate. And as they communicate, does a new organism form?
Yes. Ooh,
Like
I
does
love
something
that. Yeah.
else take shape? Not from like sitting down and making a strategic plan about how to create a new institutional religion, but
Right.
but through just the kind of proximity and the exchange of ideas, like what new shape forms as people who are partly inside and people who are partly outside of a given body, in this case, a Christian, a sense of a Christian body. And as a kind of how does that body itself begin to change through that process?
I feel it happening. I mean, I've mostly over the last many years, at least 10 years, 15 years, sort of kept my association within the Christ tradition minimized. It's like I don't want to, and the people I work with, layer my journey over theirs. And the Christian tradition has done that throughout history. And so I'm very sensitive about that. And I'm finding, I don't know, encouragement, allurement happening within me of wanting to lean in. I just wrote a blog on my Patreon site about I think it's time to take Jesus off the shelf for me and just see where does that fit in? How does that, it's not exclusive. I think there's a lot of different ways and pathways into the sacred reality of aliveness. And the Jesus story is one that has survived and is real. Like I've had experiences and I know people from other traditions who have had sort of Jesus experiences. And I don't know, I don't have words yet. I can just feel there's something emerging that it's, there's a lot of deconstruction that's been happening within a lot of people on the inside edge. Just years of deconstruction. And I feel that the reconstruction is happening, at very least for me. And I see it in other books that are coming out, and there's just something, podcasts that I've listened to or people that I've talked to, conversations, people in our program we have a year-long eco spirituality certificate, eco ministry certificate. And usually it's about half people who identify within the Christ tradition and half that don't. And when we're together, it doesn't matter. Like the edge isn't, we're that, like you said, we're on both sides of that edge. And therefore we have more in common with one another than we do with people on further in or further out. Yeah. And so, and the erasing of those edges, of those who's in and who's out, I think is part of what's emerging. It's less important to define who's in, and your own identity is important. Where do you stand? What's important to you? But
that's a source of flow, right? I mean, maybe the challenge is that we're
ecotone edge. isn't
Yeah,
straight.
we're talking in nouns and not, we're talking with landscape.
Right.
We're talking with like, almost like tree-like metaphors instead of
Yes.
wind or water. And maybe a lot of our identities, especially spiritually, is a lot more like water. Like
I
we
like
we
that. Yeah.
flow. And I feel like a lot of the people I work with are multiple. They're,
Yeah.
there's some like theological terminology about multiple belongings, but I people don't always, sometimes that language works, sometimes it doesn't, but they certainly are crisscrossing between multiple traditions, perhaps Hinduism and earth-centered spirituality, which isn't is not actually Hinduism, even though Hinduism can be very, eco-centered. Not doesn't always do some of the local ecological stuff that people want and need.
Hmm.
Um, and or they might be deeply, like some part of them might be very Quaker, but also very witchy, or right. There's so many different spaces that people go in between, and the spirit is not only inclusive, but the spirit is, so many of these traditions will compare the spirit to the breath of, the breath of God,
Mm.
and like it does not recognize these lines that we
No.
draw in the sand, and it will shift those lines around.
Yeah. Yeah. Like that ecotone
Mm-hmm,
shoreline, is
mm-hmm.
never
The
straight.
shoreline
It's
changes.
always, sometimes it floods, like right now in the whole West
Mm-hmm.
Coast. Sometimes it floods on one side and sometimes there's drought and it goes that
Mm-hmm.
way. There's that
Mm-hmm.
flow, and that's how reality is. That's how nature is. That's how spirit is. So
Mm-hmm.
anytime we try to put anything into a box, we should know. We are
Mm-hmm.
more aware that the boxes sometimes make us feel more comfortable, like
Mm-hmm.
splitting apart body, mind, spirit, for example. Sometimes it's helpful to sort of split them apart. As long as we remember, we're making that up. It's all
Mm.
whole, it's all one. We are all connected. Our individuality is important, and it's extremely not important.
Mm.
How to hold that paradox. And I think that's the whole spiritual journey, how to hold the paradox of life, holding life, or valuing life, and also valuing the sacredness of death, valuing the day and the night, valuing the masculine and the feminine, valuing the abundance and the lack, that they're all connected, but not as binaries. Like, and that's definitely emerging. You hear that kind of deconstruction in all kinds of different conversations. And I think it's part of, what Thomas Berry calls the new story, which can be taken wrong because I think it's a billions of new stories that are
Mhm.
emerging through our particularity, our particular relationships, our particular lives, our particular terrain. But all of those particularities are interconnected, like mycelium. And
Mhm.
so as we fall in love with a particular, we have a chapter in a book called The Courtship of the Particular. And that's more than saying, I love the forest. It's saying, I have spent time and invested relationship with a particular part of the forest, with a particular tree in the forest. I have fallen in love with. And so that includes things like fidelity, like going back again and again, um, I fell in love with a little family of deer in my neighborhood,
Mhm. Mhm.
Bellingham, and um, it breaks my heart. I miss them. I just met a little family here where I am in Michigan right now because I'm not in Washington anymore. But that particularity, falling in love with a particular other, just like a particular other human or a particular other child, um, opens your heart to love the whole. And then you
Mm.
step in and you love the whole in a way that then requires you to step into more particularity again. It's like this flow, even in that, of the both and.
Mm. Mm. So this is, I feel drawn to read another passage of your book, which is related but also different from what you're just talking about.
And you talk about your experience in seminary, and you went to a very different kind of seminary than I did, and that's a whole other conversation, I think. But you talk about, you say here, you wanted to learn about the process of transformation that had upended and redirected my life. I wanted not simply to learn about it, but learn how to invite other people into their own journeys of transformation to become more fully who they were created to be. The closest I could come with was a concentration they called spiritual formation. A focus on spiritual formation meant that I took jobs in mostly independent, non-denominational churches where I could do cool, contemplative kinds of things, centering prayer, retreats, small groups, midrash discussions, Bible studies, Taizé chants. Every Good Friday for several years, I built an elaborate labyrinth in the sanctuary, complete with interactive stations where you could write poems, light candles, and bury lamentations in a wailing wall constructed with at least 60 heavy stones that I drag up in a wheelbarrow from the river bottom. And candles, lots of candles. Hildegard chants played overhead. It was cool. I loved it. People came. They said it was cool, but I wasn't looking for cool. I wanted tears and psalmish anger and genuine wrestling with the disconnect we felt in our lives and our world. I wanted authentic. I didn't want formation, which began to feel like trying to tame people into a mold. I wanted transformation, where people's lives and character and values were changed, freed from the domesticating forces of culture and our own internalized limitation. The root prefix trans means through or across, meaning we are formed as we move through the ways of life changes us from life through death to new life, transformed, metamorphosed to be more like who we truly are meant to be, which is another way to say more wild. And part of what I love about that passage is I just feel like so many people can identify with creating these really cool rituals, and then wondering if they are helping, in which everyone likes and appreciates, and wondering, but are people transforming? And are people changing shape? And are we becoming like water?
Oh, good. Yes. That's it, isn't it? I mean, that's why I started this Seminary of the Wild work that's just focused on that. And the basic practice within it is so simple. It's basically go out and listen to the sacred presence that is present in all things. And there are practices, there are ways, there are spiritual, practices of fidelity, of listening. There's deeper and deeper ways of listening. There's sort of like the technology of meditation and listening, but it's so simple. It's like the transforming agent is your own willingness, an open heart to the present of sacred reality. And that's where it happens. It's like we have invitations, and we have little, what we call seedings, where we talk about things, and we have great podcasts like this one to listen to, and we have books to read, and interactive sessions and whatnot. But the core of it really is opening up your heart to this reality that we're part of. And it's like you can't really talk about it. You have to just experience it, and then you get it, and you don't have words in either. And that's something I was going to say about words that you said before, about this imperfect language, that because this is all numinous experiences based in that experience. And numinous means you definitionally can't talk about it. But when we don't talk about it, when we don't try and know that we're using imperfect words, and talk about it anyway, then it gets lost, it gets forgotten, it gets sidelined, it gets devalued. And so I think just the movement of this wild spirituality, which is just one name for it, there's a whole bunch of micro movements that are the same movement, is reconnection with the whole, reconnection with, that we're part of nature, reconnecting kinship, moving into that kinship worldview. And that as foundational for all the work we have to do, which is all the work. There's so much work to do to deal with the reality of the disconnection for the last several hundred years that have led to a lot of ecological damage and cultural oppression.
And how is it going in terms of like bringing people again and again and again into like outside of buildings and into groves or trees and lakes and different, I know you're going to a lot of different spaces and encouraging an encounter with the wild that is within an explicitly sacred container with others, not by yourself, but in community. How is that going and what are you finding in that?
It's beautiful. I just realized like a year ago, going, this is what I want the church to be. This is it, that we're honoring that each person has a place and a purpose within this evolving life. And part of that is undoing our complicity with our culture, which is inherently disconnecting. And part of it is learning to trust your own inner knowing and questioning some of the external authority that we've succumbed to. And part of it is learning how to listen and open up to the voices of the trees and the wind and the waters. And people are changing. I mean, we've been doing this Seminary of the Wild this is our 5th cohort now. We've got 50 people in it, and it's a year-long program. And just seeing not only how their relationship with their place and their own sense of calling shifts, but seeing what they're doing since then. They talk about the experience sort of before and after.
Can you give like 1 or 2 examples?
Sure. There's the first person that comes to my mind was in our first cohort. He's a dad. He's got 3 young kids, and he was sensing he was in a pretty traditional church situation and feeling more and more disconnected, more and more connected with the land, and didn't know what to do with it. And so throughout the program, he realized his calling was to be a more wild dad. And so he was going to commit to preserving his children's wild connection with who they are. And he did a beautiful job with that. Well, since graduating, so 3 years ago, he's since connected with some friends who are farmers. He lives in Denver, and farmers in eastern Colorado who are planting kernza, which is a wheat that is sustainable. And you don't need to wipe it all out every year and plant new. It's perennial. And it's not really supported by the government because it doesn't need a whole bunch of pesticides. It's very organic and natural. But it's a difficult path for them. And he's a salesman and, provides well for his family and what he sells, Vans, tennis shoes. And he realized that his gifts can actually help that movement of this new kind of wheat that actually restores the soil, doesn't deplete it, that doesn't bring more toxins in and that kind of thing. But what he's done is he's creating a network of connections to local bakeries and local breweries to use this sustainable, kind of wheat. And so he never expected that, but something in him started churning. And there's another woman who's a hairdresser, And she does things like, not only uses products that don't damage the earth or your hair or your personhood, but also adds little rituals, like think about before you come to your appointment, what are you letting go of as we cut your hair? And then she gives them a little bit of their hair in a little bag and gives it to them and say, you might want to do a little ritual about this and bury something. Like, how beautiful is that? So little things, it's like, as we know, we're part of a larger movement of reconnection. Those ideas will come, and they're not just human ingenuity, like it's in relationship with the land herself, who has a wisdom that we need. And so it is the pathway to restoring who we are and why we're here, and to the kinds of ideas that we're probably not going to come up with on our own, even with the best muse moments. We need to be in that reciprocity, that relationship of reciprocity with the more than human others, which also is, it's sort of like a gateway to that reciprocity relationship with other humans. It's, just as our disconnection happens with that same worldview of hierarchy and human supremacy or white supremacy leads to all kinds of oppression and destruction. The restoration is connected with our human and more than human relationships, as we deepen into these practices of listening to the other as a sacred other who has wisdom that we need, and we have wisdom that they need. There is a reciprocity, not only of physically, like our CO2 that we release is an actual part of us is released, and the trees benefit from that. And the oxygen that the trees release benefits us. So we know the water we drink and what we release to the earth is needed. But that's also true emotionally and spiritually, that reciprocity. When we've cut that off, we've cut off something of our own wholeness and our own access to the sacred and our own access to what it means to be human in this interconnected relationship of life.
Well, it's a movement towards, and you talk about this in such a beautiful way in your book, of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to admit, this might be one of my favorite parts, perhaps because I didn't know it. Is you have a couple
in the beginning
pages. In the beginning was the logos, yes. And you have a couple pages where you delve into the word logos. And now our listeners are probably familiar with the phrase in John, in the beginning there was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. And this is, one could talk for several hours about the importance of this particular passage in Christian history, which I would be very happy to do sometime. And you remind us that the word logos was translated to mean word, which has a little tiny bit of truth in it, but it's in many ways a very inadequate translation of logos. And logos is much closer to the meaning of, and you quote Heraclitus, who develops the word logos to conceptualize the way the word functions as a collective, which he calls the cosmos. Logos is the principle or power that shapes and creates all things, immanent and embedded in all that exists. He sees things not as things, but as processes. I'm going to read that again. He sees things not really as things, but as processes. Logos, he intuited, is the relationship between all things, holding them together. Later, Greek philosophers would use the word logos to describe the relationship between as a process of dialogue. You then compare it to the Stoics and the Egyptian, Chinese, Persians, the Tao, which I think many people are familiar, at least with the basic principle underlying the structures of the universe. And then you say that logos holds an explicit sense that everything in nature is filled with a kind of divine indwelling, worthy of reverence. It is similar to what biologists are revealing now about the ways trees talk to one another and what quantum scientists have discovered at the center of molecules, not things, but relationships. Logos is about the divine relationship between all things, the system of their connection, conversation. Another translation you describe later is not word, but conversation, the Greek sermo. It's indicating not a one-way sermon, as we tend to use it today, but a lively discourse, a dialogue, a manner of speaking back and forth, a conversation, a noun created from the root verb sero, which means to weave or join. Sermo is an intimate living of life together, living among, familiarity, intimate conversation, the act of living with. Sermo was a Latin translation that best fit the meaning of logos. And because of a series of political and patriarchal events that happened, that word was not ever passed down to us in the translations. And so this is like, I feel like this is like, should be front page news.
Right?
Because it's like, oh, wait, look, no, actually in Christian Western culture, there is this phenomenal notion of the dialogical nature and relationship nature of all beings, and the Gospel of John, which is not usually described as a progressive gospel. The Gospel of John like starts by describing God and Jesus as conversation, as relationship, as interaction, as the interbeingness, and that it's actually at the heart of the Christian tradition that was mistranslated.
Yes, and that's the part that infuriates me, because
It's horrible. Like how
were
much would have been different in Christian history had
yes,
that not happened?
imagine that. Yeah, and then right around the time of the Reformation, there was a man, Erasmus of Rotterdam, that I also talk about in the book, who is the first person in 1,000 years to translate the original Greek. Once the powers that be decided this is the way we're going to say it, we're going to use the word instead of the word conversation, because they used the word conversation, the Latin word conversation, for the first 3 centuries. And it was an intentional shift. And Erasmus, when he translated, he was like, wait a minute, this means conversation. And he translated it that way. And the Catholic Church freaked out. And even the Protestants, who liked some of the other things he was translating, rejected it as well, because it threatens the hierarchy that is the core of the way the religion had become. And it bugs me that there's not a single translation available. In the Council of Trent in the 16th century, they burned all of his translations, and even the Protestants, who kept a lot of his translations, threw that part out. And so there's not a single translation. I hope someday, I can't wait till someday, it's going to happen, that there will be a translation with this corrected, because it has so much meaning. It's funny because it's just a word. It's just, but words have power, and these stories have power, and how different it is. And I think that's what's emerging, even the emergence of these podcasts, is a form of conversation that wasn't here, 25 years ago. And so this idea of Christ as conversation, because logos was the word that John was using to kind of describe to the first century followers of what is the meaning of Christ now that Jesus said, and like that Christ is that reality of love between two sacred thous, between two beings, between two places. And so that's the presence of Christ that I can fully embrace.
And when we think about that, and we think about what does it mean for God, for the conversation to be at the beginning of all time, not only does that really match with physics and other traditions and indigenous wisdom, but it puts at the heart of this Christian tradition both that Jesus and that the lineage of that Jesus is carrying is a lineage of conversation, and that tells us what our relationship for those who are seeking to follow Jesus to the rest of the world is a conversational relationship. And that mirrors, and that would help explain why it is that when people who are going through your programs, and for the many other listeners out there who are helping to lead people into a different sense of who they are, in part through their profound connection with oceans and waters and trees and seeds, and wild beings of all kinds, and especially including ourselves, that new ideas show up because it's a conversation.
Right. That's how conversations work. I mean, when you've been in a great conversation, you walk away from that feeling, high. You walk away from that feeling seen. You walk away from that releasing some of your old ideas and owning some new ones, and something new is created through that conversation. Those are authentic conversations.
Right. And so, of course, people are going to create new things while in conversation with other beings. And that other beings might create new things too. I mean, it's just like we don't even like we're so far removed from this nature. And I just want to read this part, because you do actually rewrite it for your audience, at least this one paragraph. In the beginning was a conversation, and the conversation was with God, and the conversation was God. This was with God in the beginning. All things came into being through this, and apart from this, nothing came into being that has come into being. And the conversation became flesh and dwelt among us. And to hear that, to me, like, really does change the meaning of what is possible within Christianity.
And what is possible within life, really. I mean, but within Christianity, like, what does that look like? And that's why I started Wild Church. What does that look like to create a, collective experience of, let's just use some of the old words, of worship, with conversation at the center instead of word. So that means, this is how a lot of the Wild churches, their flow is it begins with, some kind of invitation that centers us into something. And then it's an invitation to go out around. First of all, it's set up in a circle, because it's set up as a conversation, not as one person talking to everybody else. So it's in a circle. And then you leave the circle, and you allow yourself to wander and be drawn to some particular other, and to listen and enter into conversation, essentially. You come back then, and there's an important step of coming back and sharing that experience with other humans, and hearing their conversations, and seeing how those weave together. And so when you base a collective gathering on conversation versus word, it's a very different experience.
So I want to take through this last section of our last kind of main question here for this podcast, and talk a little bit about this other piece of your work or your life, because these things are always intertwined, which is that a key, it's like such an important thing, and I really want us to be able to spend a little bit of time with it, which is that you are a mother of two amazing children. And that your son, at a very early age, became a climate activist. I want you to kind of just, if you can just briefly narrate this story of that experience, keeping in mind that many of our listeners are themselves parents of children of all ages, and this question of, like, what does it mean to raise children in an era of climate change, is a huge one for so many people who I engage with, and for so many people just in general. And if you can kind of walk us through a little bit of the story of your son becoming this well-known climate activist, and kind of place this in history to help contextualize it.
Yeah. Let's see where to start so that it's brief and yet the full story. So when I was pregnant with him, I was working on this intersection between spirituality or religion and ecology with an evangelical relief and development organization. And I was doing that work the whole time I was pregnant with him. I think that's important somehow. I ended up, after he was born, leaving that work, setting it all aside. Something I had written was sent to like 50,000 evangelical churches to say, it was called Let the Earth Be Glad. Let's just let it be glad. And Al Gore had sent me a letter of commendation, and my career was starting to take off. But I recognized that I needed to focus on being a mom. It was my decision. Another decision is equally valid. But it was 12 years later when my son was 12. I was transitioning between the corporate world, and I had left the church, being a pastor. And I remember this day, I was just putting all of those ecology books, the climate books, in a box and saying, I just need to get rid of this. We're moving to a smaller house. And at the last minute, I kept out Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth video for my son, who was then 12, and he loved nature. He loved natural disasters, actually, volcanoes and things like that. And so we all sat down that night and watched the DVD. And he was transfixed and very quiet. Went to, my daughter and I got up. I was a single mom at the time. I was a single mom the whole time raising them, except for the first couple of years. But my daughter and I got up, did something else. He watched the whole movie again, watched all the special features, and went to bed quietly. The next day, he went to school and was telling all his friends, he's in seventh grade, telling all his friends, we got to stop global warming. And he's starting a protest in his class that we're going to stop global warming. And his friends were pushing back on him that global warming is not real, that Al Gore is a liar, that kind of thing that they had heard from their parents. And he came home and created his own presentation and went back to school and gave it to his friends at recess. That's the beginning. And from there, I was able to connect him to somebody in San Diego, where he got a tour of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He was able to, hold million-year-old ice and hear from the scientists, and that deepened it for him, that he had something important to say and to do. And it sort of happened spontaneously, where he kept getting invited. He created this little presentation. He gave it one place, and then everything else happened. And within a year, he was giving presentations all over the country. Within a few years, all over the world. He was sort of Greta 15 years ago. But at the time, there were no youth, hard to imagine, but at the time, there were no youth climate organizations. And so we ended up starting one on our own. He started it, I supported him. And, by 2011, we had, we were arranging, he was speaking all over the world. He quit school. He was speaking 2 weeks out of every month. We were on the road and organizing marches, youth-led marches all over the world. We sued every state and national government, and the climate, the climate lawsuit a lot of people are aware of now grew out of the lawsuit the lawsuits that we did. And it was magnificent. And it was a real burnout, particularly for him, to be on stage or something really, he gave up, and he knew it at the time even. He gave up his adolescence for this. He gave up time with friends. He gave up being in school to do normal sports and normal things. And he doesn't regret it, but it did lead him to a really significant reckoning, not just with that youthful, like, we can change this, we can, we are the generation to make a difference, and then it doesn't make a difference. In the big scale, the numbers just keep going up, no matter what, even though there's been millions and millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars put into changing the paradigm, and it is changing very, very slowly, but the CO2 levels keep going up. So not only that seeming, we didn't actually make a difference. We thought we were going to make a difference, but also he had an experience when he was in college, and he was sort of starting to want to back off of being a spokesperson, wanting to be a normal kid again. And he organized it was kind of an equinox 24-hour thing in the forest. He loved the forest, where he went to school in British Columbia. And a couple weeks before his event, he ran out to the land, and he was stopped by armed guards and had to watch as his land he had fallen in love with up there was deforested before his eyes. And he heard the animals and the birds in a lament he had never experienced before, as they vacated their homes and landed in the small area that was still untouched. So that was devastating to him. And then he and a couple other friends organized a grief ceremony, and nobody showed up. So just that, I think, was even more devastating to him. It's just like, these are young people who care about, they were at a school that cares about ecology and environment. And so it was several years of where he was very depressed, and his recovery then was in deep relationship with the shoreline, with a very specific little tiny area of the shore in Olympia, Washington, where he fell in love with the place. So it was interesting that as I was, as we let go of the organization, once he went to college, I kind of went my way into Church of the Wild kind of stuff, and he went his way, which is in this deep connection with the land. We sort of ended up in a similar place.
And how was it for you as a mom, like watching both this sort of rise and like his experience of burnout? Like, how was that for you?
Yeah, devastating. I mean, this is a whole session to talk about this. But first of all, like, there's something about that middle school age, that 7th and 8th grade. It's like this liminal space between this time of, listening to your parents, listening to your community, and then in high school, you're kind of listening to peers. And there's this little space, I think, in middle school, just like middle age, where if you as a parent really pay attention, the glimpses of who this little person is start to show up. And so it's paying attention to what they're interested in and what they're drawn to and what they love, and then putting yourself in a position where you can support that, which is what I did. I quit my job, and we did this full time together, which was great and also weird. And like, he was missing his adolescence, and we were blurring mother, working together, coach roles. That took some untangling. We were aware of it even during the time. And I saw how he was being impacted by it. He was both motivated and really stepping into his gifts. He has a gift of public speaking and of taking complex things and translating that into something motivational. That's a gift that a lot of the other kids we worked with didn't necessarily have. But when I saw how, this is going to sound bad, but I'm just going to say it. I don't think I've said it publicly on a podcast before, but when I saw how the movement itself was using him, just as they're using Greta, because this is how, the government will listen to children sounds good, but it's actually using the children for your agenda that happens to coincide with their agenda, but there's still a sense of being used and being objectified that is heartbreaking and infuriating. And once I really saw what was happening with him, and, because I could really, we could talk about it through the whole process that, what's written in a newspaper about you isn't about you. What's written as in these nasty comments in social media isn't about you, but both the accolades and the nasty comments are about other people. They're not about you. And so stay focused on who you are and what you're drawn to do. And I could do that with my own son. But it's another thing to bring other people's children into this. And it seemed like a good thing, to support these young people who are passionate about this. But to do it in a way where they're not being used is a whole different organization than what it had become. And so
Yeah, I mean, like that is so critical. It's a critical conversation. We absolutely just, it deserves in and of itself an entire, at least an hour podcast.
yeah.
And I'm saying this in part because I feel like it's going to come up again and again and again as more and more children, as every new kind of wave of encounter the reality of the future that they are living into. So it's really important. But I just sort of want to take a moment to acknowledge how hard that was for you and for him, and I'm sure for many, many, many others. And I think it's a combination, right? It's both being used and objectified, and it not changing.
Right, both of those. Yeah.
If it was a guarantee that to be used is to affect change, I think many of us would have but it's like that's not like
And
to
it does.
to see
It's
things
not
get
like it doesn't change at all, right? I mean,
Mhm.
there is change. There's more awareness now. There we do have a climate, some legislation. There is some change, but it's not on the level that's needed. And young people are needed for the movement when you think about it that way, because they don't know that yet. They still have an energy and excitement, which that's where they get used. But what is the way that we can support one another in the it's holding the both again. This is a spiritual journey, holding both the hope and we're in this together, and the changing the laws, and the grief. We have to hold that despair and be real about it, and give space for these young people to grieve and to come out the other side. And we don't want that. We want our kids to not have to deal with it, but it's real.
And also to shift how we do activism, to shift
Right.
right. I mean, you write about this. I mean, I love this paragraph. Burnout is almost built into activism. The sheer amount of energy and time and money needed to pull off each campaign is incredible. We choose a particular instrumental change for the millions that need to happen, create a strategy, design the campaign, identify the enemy, come up with an easy enough ask, raise the money, show up for interviews, write blogs, shoot more videos, shout more loudly, and measure success by the number of new names in our database and followers on social media. Because really, can we measure our success by an aggregate CO2 decline? No, that's too discouraging. Even with all the movement that the movement has accomplished, the CO2 imbalance keeps increasing. So we stay focused on the goals before us, measuring success by metrics that don't matter. And once one campaign is finished, it's time to start over with the next one. It's like trying to move a mountain one pebble at a time. Everyone is so busy and overworked and underfunded that we hardly have time to touch the very earth we are working so hard to get people to protect. And herein lies the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is why I say and believe and experience that this deep connection with the very earth we're working so hard to protect is foundational, no matter what it is, no matter what our activism is, our business is, our work is. That deep relationship grounds everything we do in love and interconnection, that gives us the energy and the purpose and the motivation to keep going. and to keep doing what is good and right and loving, no matter what.
It sounds like a kind of remembering.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be able to share with you, and thank you for sharing so openly and generously with us today. And I just want to ask if there's anything around remembering and re-enchanting that you want to leave us with today.
I would say remember yourself back into sacred relationship with your place. And that can be little tiny steps where you regard the spider with her little sack of babies in your windowsill with a kindness. That can be getting to know your trees more deeply. That can be treating all the creatures that are in your place with a different kind of kindness, a deeper kindness. And it's simple. It's a simple reorientation of yourself as part of an interconnected nature. We are part of nature.
Yeah, the simplicity of it is so important. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thank you, Sara.
Links to the book and the organizations will be in the show notes as usual. And I encourage folks to keep walking that simple way.
Thank you. Many blessings.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.